March 1945, skies above Tokyo shimmer with heat and smoke. Japanese radar operators stare at their screens in disbelief. The blips shouldn't be there. At nearly 30,000 feet, formation after formation of B-29 superfortresses cross the coast. They've come from the newly captured island of Iwo Jima, more than 1,500 miles from their home bases in the Marianas. But this time, something is different. Trailing alongside the bombers, keeping perfect formation, are sleek silver fighters, faster, lighter, and impossibly distant from any known Allied airfield. Japanese interceptors scramble to meet them, expecting the usual advantage in range and maneuverability. But as the two sides converge, the illusion collapses. The mysterious fighters dive, climb, and chase with impossible endurance. They don't turn back. On the ground, Japanese engineers gather fragments of wreckage that fall from the sky. They read the stamped markings, North American P-51 Mustang. And as the engineers study its design, one question echoes through the hangars of Tokyo. How could an American fighter fly that far? Without refueling? To understand the shock that rippled through Japan's engineering corps in 1945, we must begin years earlier, when the balance of air power in the Pacific looked very different. In late 1941 and early 1942, Japan ruled the skies. Its Mitsubishi A6M fighter was light, agile, and had astonishing range, over 1,900 kilometers on internal fuel. In contrast, early American and British fighters were short-legged and heavy, designed more for European skies than the vast Pacific. The Zero became a symbol of Japan's technological confidence, proof that its engineers could outthink and outfly the West. But as the war expanded, Japan's early lead became a trap. Its aircraft, built for range and agility, sacrificed armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and speed at altitude. American pilots learned quickly, adapting tactics to exploit those weaknesses. Still, the Pacific's immense distances remained an unsolved problem for the Allies. Every bomber that took off from the Marianas or Australia faced the same nightmare. Once it crossed the open ocean, there was no fighter cover. The bombers flew unprotected against enemy fighters, often hundreds of miles from safety. American planners knew that unless they solved this range problem, strategic bombing of Japan itself would remain a costly gamble. At first, engineers tried to stretch the endurance of existing aircraft. The P-38 Lightning could fly long distances, but it was complex and underpowered at high altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt was rugged but thirsty, its massive radial engine devouring fuel. The early P-40 Warhawk performed well in China and North Africa, but its limited range made it nearly useless in the Central Pacific. The search for the ideal escort fighter grew urgent in 1943, as the U.S. prepared to bring the air war to Japan's doorstep. That quest led to a young company in California, North American Aviation, which promised something radical. In just 117 days, its engineers produced a new prototype unlike any other Allied fighter. It had a long, elegant fuselage, thin laminar-flow wings that reduced drag, and space for drop tanks that could be jettisoned mid-flight. The company called it the P-51 Mustang. Initially, the Mustang was powered by an American Allison engine, reliable but weak at high altitude. Its performance was solid at low levels but disappointing above 15,000 feet, where bomber formations flew. The design had potential, yet it wasn't until British engineers proposed an audacious idea that everything changed, replacing the Allison with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire. When the first Merlin-equipped Mustangs took off in late 1943, the transformation stunned test pilots. The aircraft climbed faster, cruised farther, and fought higher than any Allied fighter in service. Suddenly, America had the machine it needed, a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return home. But the Mustang's story wasn't only about engineering brilliance. It was about timing and the industrial engine of the United States. By 1944, American factories produced aircraft at a pace Japan couldn't imagine. Over 96,000 planes that year alone. Behind every Mustang in the sky stood thousands of workers, machinists, and scientists, united by an industrial rhythm Japan's limited economy couldn't match. Still, the Pacific remained the hardest test. The distances were longer than Europe's and the missions harsher, The Mustang would have to prove it could fly not just to Tokyo, but back again. That challenge would soon arrive. In the spring of 1945, when U.S. Marines captured a small volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Japan. Its name was Iwo Jima. From this desolate patch of black sand, American engineers began transforming the island into the most valuable airbase in the Pacific. 3 massive runways carved from volcanic ash would allow P-51 Mustangs to launch alongside B-29 bombers, escorting them all the way to the heart of Japan. The Japanese command knew what that meant, and feared it. But no one, not even their top engineers, understood how far the Mustangs could truly go, until they appeared above Tokyo's skies. The spring of 1945 marked the beginning of a new kind of air war over Japan, one that would test the limits of endurance, technology, and belief. For months, American B-29 superfortresses had been bombing Japan from distant bases in the Mariana Islands, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, a round trip of more than 3,000 miles over open ocean. It was one of the longest, most dangerous bomber routes ever attempted. Crews faced mechanical failures, unpredictable weather, and relentless Japanese fighters waiting near the coast. The B-29s could defend themselves, but without escort fighters, their losses were severe. The Army Air Forces knew that every additional mile of range meant fewer bombers returning home. They needed escort coverage all the way to the Japanese homeland, a task that seemed impossible given the vastness of the Pacific. Then, the capture of Iwo Jima changed everything. Located roughly 660 miles south of Tokyo, Iwo Jima was strategically perfect. American engineers and Seabees worked day and night to carve long runways into its volcanic rock. Within weeks, the island became the critical halfway point, a toritom lifeline for damaged bombers and a launch pad for the newly arrived P-51 Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command. These Mustangs would escort B-29s to Japan, protect them from interceptors, and attack targets of opportunity on the return flight. It was a mission that demanded incredible range, nearly 1,500 miles round trip, often through unpredictable winds and over empty seas. But the P-51, with its combination of internal fuel efficiency and external drop tanks, could do it. Each aircraft carried a pair of 75-gallon or 110-gallon tanks, designed to be released once empty. With the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel economy at cruise altitude, the Mustang could fly deep into Japan, fight, and still make it home. When the first formations appeared over Tokyo in March 1945, Japanese pilots assumed the fighters had been launched from nearby carriers. But the truth was more astonishing. They had come all the way from Iwo Jima, escorting bombers for hours without turning back. Inside Japan's technical divisions, confusion spread. Reports arrived from airfields describing new Allied fighters with unknown fuel systems. Engineers at Nakajima and Mitsubishi collected fragments from downed Mustangs. They examined the wing structure, fuel lines, and tanks, expecting to find hidden mechanisms or special additives. What they discovered instead was simplicity refined to perfection. The Mustang's laminar-flow wing, designed to reduce drag, gave it an aerodynamic efficiency far beyond most Japanese aircraft. The precision manufacturing of American factories ensured every rivet, every surface was smooth, reducing resistance and conserving fuel. Combined with the Packard-built Merlin engine, optimized for high-altitude performance, the result was unprecedented range for a single-seat fighter. To Japanese engineers accustomed to hand-built aircraft and small production runs, the Mustang's precision felt alien, industrial artistry at a scale they could scarcely imagine. Meanwhile, in American briefings on Iwo Jima, pilots were learning to exploit every advantage. They flew in disciplined formations, maintained tight fuel management routines, and trusted their navigation instruments implicitly. It wasn't only the aircraft that gave them range, it was the system behind it: logistics, engineering, and planning. As the Mustang missions increased, the psychological impact grew. Japanese fighter pilots, once proud of their long-range Zeros, found themselves unable to match the endurance of these new invaders. They could engage briefly, but while they had to turn back to refuel, the Mustangs remained overhead, relentless, circling, waiting. The skies that once belonged to Japan were now under constant watch. And on the ground, in the hangars of Tokyo, A growing sense of realization set in. The enemy had mastered not just flying, but distance itself. That revelation would soon collide with the harsh reality of combat, as the Mustang's arrival transformed the air war over Japan from a defensive struggle into a one-sided onslaught. The genius of the Mustang was not in secret devices or unexplainable chemistry. It was in how efficiently it used everything it carried. While Japanese engineers initially searched for hidden fuel compartments or exotic alloys, they soon realized that the aircraft's superiority came from a convergence of small, precise innovations. The Mustang's laminar-flow wing, designed at North American Aviation under Edgar Schmood, allowed air to flow smoothly over the surface, dramatically reducing drag. This gave the aircraft not only higher speed but also better fuel efficiency at cruising power. Equally transformative was its Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the U.S. Its two-stage supercharger maintained engine power even above 25,000 feet, letting the Mustang fly higher, faster, and longer than the Zeros and Ki-84s opposing it. Japanese aircraft, by comparison, lost performance sharply at altitude. Their engines, optimized for medium altitudes and low weight, lacked superchargers capable of sustained power in thin air. This single difference explained much of what Japanese engineers couldn't understand. It wasn't magic. It was industrial precision, a mastery of airflow and fuel control born from data, not improvisation. Where Japan relied on craftsmanship, the United States relied on repeatable accuracy. Each Mustang that rolled off the line in Inglewood, California, was nearly identical to the next. Every bolt torque, every rivet pattern, every weld was measured, recorded, and replicated. In Japan, factories often hand-fitted parts. In America, parts were interchangeable. That industrial philosophy, more than any hidden secret, gave the Mustang its wings. With the Mustang, the U.S. Army Air Forces achieved something Japan had considered impossible: a coordinated aerial network stretching thousands of miles. Before the P-51, bombing raids were isolated, desperate efforts. Bombers would take off, fly alone for hours, drop their payloads, and pray to make it home. But now, every B-29 formation that left Iwo Jima or the Marianas carried a protective envelope of Mustangs. Each mission was a demonstration of planning and communication. Fighters and bombers used synchronized radio frequencies and time-coded rendezvous points to meet mid-air, sometimes hundreds of miles from their respective bases. Refueling wasn't possible, so the margin of error was measured in minutes and gallons. Every Mustang pilot learned to throttle back during cruise, lean the fuel mixture, and climb gradually to conserve energy. Japanese interceptors, used to fighting short, quick engagements, couldn't comprehend how their opponents stayed aloft for so long. They assumed the Americans had built a new kind of fuel or engine. The truth was far simpler: discipline and data. By early 1945, escort missions became routine. The Mustangs launched from Iwo Jima, met the bombers over the Pacific, and continued north toward Japan's industrial heartland. Once above Tokyo or Yokohama, they switched roles. Half the formation guarded the B-29s, while the others descended to strafe airfields, trains, and radar sites. Every engagement chipped away at Japan's remaining defensive strength. When fuel ran low, the fighters would peel off, glide toward the coast, and make the long return to Iwo Jima. For Japanese observers, watching these planes appear and vanish with mathematical precision was disorienting. The skies, once unpredictable, were now methodically controlled. Among Japan's engineers and pilots, the Mustang provoked both professional admiration and despair. Captured fragments of wrecked P-51s were studied in labs at Tachikawa and Yokosuka. Teams from Nakajima, Kawasaki, and the Imperial Army Air Technical Research Institute pored over fuel system diagrams, trying to understand the secret of the Mustang's endurance. What they found was humbling: lightweight aluminum tanks perfectly integrated into the wings, seamless fuel transfer lines, and aerodynamic tanks that could be jettisoned mid-flight, each a product of advanced metallurgy and precision assembly. Japanese engineers had designed elegant planes, but they were built within limits: scarce materials, smaller engines, limited testing. The Mustang represented what Japan could not produce: industrial consistency backed by infinite resources. For young Japanese pilots, the contrast was crushing. Their Zeros had once been symbols of invincibility. Now they were fragile, flammable, and outclassed. Many pilots described the P-51s as ghost fighters, able to appear, strike, and vanish over distances no one thought possible. The realization ran deeper than technology. It spoke to the industrial and cultural divide that had widened over 4 years of war. While Japan still built aircraft by hand, America had mastered a war fought by machines that made other machines, a scale Japan's island economy could never sustain. By the time the first Mustangs escorted bombers to Tokyo, Japanese engineers had already seen the future of air warfare, and it wasn't theirs. The next stage would show just how devastating that realization could become once the Mustangs began systematically dismantling Japan's ability to fight back. To Japanese pilots, the first encounters with the P-51 Mustang were both bewildering and terrifying. For years, the Imperial Air Force had defined combat on its own terms: fast attacks, short engagements, and quick returns to base. The Zero's light frame and massive fuel tanks allowed long-range patrols early in the war. But by 1945, Japan's fuel shortages and outdated engine technology had erased that advantage. When the P-51s appeared over Tokyo and Nagoya, Japanese pilots expected them to peel off after a few minutes of combat, as other Allied fighters had. But the Mustangs did not leave. They chased Japanese interceptors across entire provinces, diving and climbing with precision, showing no concern for distance. Radio transcripts captured fragments of disbelief. "These fighters follow us all the way from the sea," one pilot reported. "Impossible. They should have no fuel." From their cockpits, Japanese flyers saw not just an enemy aircraft, but an enemy system. The Mustangs operated in disciplined formations, each pilot trusting his instruments, his commander, and his mechanics on Iwo Jima. Even when outnumbered, they fought with coordination rarely seen in Japan's increasingly desperate air force. By contrast, Japan's defense network was collapsing. Radar coverage was patchy. Many interceptors launched with half-filled fuel tanks due to shortages. The P-51's endurance exposed every weakness, every broken link, in Japan's air defense chain. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots realized that the Americans had achieved what their own engineers once dreamed of: complete aerial control, sustained by fuel, data, and industry. The Mustang's long legs were not simply a feat of design, they were the triumph of an entire industrial ecosystem. At North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, the production line ran 24 hours a day. Components arrived from across the United States: Packard engines from Detroit, plexiglass canopies from Pennsylvania, aluminum forgings from Cleveland. Each part fit perfectly into place because American industry had standardized every measurement. Japanese intelligence reports noted this with alarm. A downed Mustang revealed a serial plate with the words, "Inglewood, California, 1944. To Japanese analysts, this single marking told a grim story. While their own aircraft factories were being bombed into rubble, American plants were producing perfect machines by the thousands. In one internal report from the Imperial Army Aeronautical Department, an engineer wrote, "The Americans have achieved an impossible balance, quantity without losing precision. That precision was the unseen weapon of the Mustang. Japanese factories could build prototypes of extraordinary creativity, but they could not replicate them quickly." The P-51 was proof that America had industrialized innovation itself. It was this power that made the Mustang not just a plane, but a statement. The enemy could replace every loss. Japan could not. For Japan's airmen and engineers, the emotional impact of the P-51 went far beyond the battlefield. It became a symbol of inevitability, the physical embodiment of a truth many had begun to whisper. Japan could not win a war of endurance. When Mustangs began strafing airfields and transport convoys deep inside Japan, there was a sense of disbelief. Air bases once considered untouchable were suddenly under attack. Trains, factories, even communication lines came under relentless assault. Pilots described seeing the silver fighters circle above the smoke like hawks, methodically searching for targets. "They stayed in the sky all day," one officer recalled after the raid on Tachikawa. "They did not tire, and they did not run out of fuel." This persistence wore down morale faster than bombs. Japan's famed Bushido spirit met something it couldn't defeat: logistical infinity. Every Mustang represented the unseen might of American oil, industry, and mathematics. In technical schools, professors showed their students diagrams of the P-51's engine systems, trying to explain what made it different. Some still hoped to adapt the lessons, but by mid-1945, Japan lacked both materials and time. The engineers' reports no longer spoke of countermeasures. They spoke of admiration. The Mustang had not just defeated Japan's Air Force, it had humbled its engineering pride. The summer of 1945, that humility would turn into resignation, as the Mustangs, now fully integrated into bombing raids, paved the way for the final stage of the air campaign, the complete destruction of Japan's capacity to fight. The next chapter would reveal that decisive moment, when the Mustang's endurance turned from shock into devastation. March 4, 1945, Iwo Jima airfield. The volcanic dust still hangs in the air as mechanics finish loading ammunition belts and checking oxygen lines. Rows of silver Mustangs shimmer in the morning light, their wings glinting like mirrors against the black sand. On their fuselages are hand-painted names: Mary Lou, Southern Belle, Angel's Wing. It is the first fully coordinated long-range bomber escort mission from Iwo Jima. The target, Tokyo. At 07:45 hours, the roar begins. B-29. Superfortresses rise into the dawn, heavy with bombs, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Behind them, the P-51D Mustangs roll down the runways one after another, climbing to meet the bombers at 20,000 feet. Each Mustang carries two 110-gallon drop tanks, carefully filled to the ounce. Pilots have memorized the sequence: climb at 2,600 RPM, lean mixture to auto-lean, cruise at 230 knots, and drop tanks at the first sight of the Japanese coast. The math is unforgiving. Every pilot knows that one mistake in throttle control could mean the difference between returning home or vanishing into the Pacific. For the Japanese radar stations on Honshu, the signal comes late. Their screens flicker with dozens of returns, more than 100 bombers accompanied by smaller blips traveling with them. Confusion spreads. Escort fighters? Impossible. They cannot have reached this far, a technician reports. Minutes later, contrails bloom over Tokyo. The B-29s begin their bombing runs. But the real surprise is just behind them. The Mustangs, breaking off in pairs to engage the interceptors rising from Chofu, Tachikawa, and Yokosuka. The first dogfights erupt in perfect blue skies. Japanese Ki-84. Hayats and Zeros climb desperately to meet the invaders, but the outcome is one-sided. The P-51s, faster and steadier at altitude, dive through the interceptors with lethal precision. Their 650 caliber Browning machine guns rip through wings and fuel tanks with terrifying accuracy. From the ground, Japanese civilians look up in disbelief. Fighters streak across the sky, some painted with the white star and bar of the U.S. Army Air Forces, symbols once seen only at the edges of the empire, now above its capital. At the air base near Yokosuka, engineers rush outside to witness what seems impossible. Two Mustangs chase a Zero across the coast, neither breaking off. "How?" one officer mutters. Their fuel should be gone. Hours pass. The B-29s turn homeward, smoke columns rising behind them. Yet the P-51s remain, circling over the coast, strafing airfields, attacking trains and trucks fleeing the burning cities. Their shadows race across the countryside like silent omens. By early afternoon, Japanese interceptors have all but vanished. Most aircraft that took off are either destroyed or out of fuel. The surviving pilots, shaken and exhausted, return to their bases only to find them under Mustang attack. The humiliation is complete. Over Tokyo Bay, Major James B. Tapp of the 78th Fighter Squadron leads his group in a long, banking turn toward the sea. The radio crackles with brief confirmations: fuel levels, positions, damaged aircraft. Some Mustangs are running on fumes, but the plan holds. At the halfway mark, the formation drops to low altitude, engines throttled back for maximum range. By evening, one by one, the Mustangs touch down on Iwo Jima's scarred runways. Mechanics count the returning aircraft. Losses are light. The mission has succeeded. The unthinkable is now routine. American fighters have flown to Tokyo and back. News spreads fast through both sides. In the United States, headlines celebrate Mustangs over Tokyo. In Japan, disbelief turns into grim acceptance. The Imperial High Command issues orders to study the new enemy fighter and develop countermeasures, but no one knows how. There is nothing comparable in Japan's arsenal. For Japan's engineers, the mystery becomes an obsession. How could a single-seat fighter cross such distances, fight for hours, and return safely? Days later, recovery teams collect wreckage from a downed Mustang near Chiba. The debris reveals the truth: efficient design, clean aerodynamics, self-sealing fuel tanks, and modular construction. No secret fuel, no hidden device, just pure engineering discipline. The realization spreads through the ranks like cold wind. Japan had built fighters with spirit. America had built fighters with science, and with that understanding came a darker truth, one that many refused to voice aloud. If the Americans could send fighters this far, what else could they now reach? The answer would come soon, as the Mustangs returned mission after mission to finish what they had begun. By late March 1945, the Mustangs from Iwo Jima had turned what was once an untouchable fortress into open sky. Every morning, the distant hum of their Packard-built Merlin engines echoed across the Pacific, a mechanical omen that Tokyo's air defenses could no longer ignore. On March 18th, radar posts detected another massive formation. Hundreds of B-29s once again bound for Nagoya. The Japanese scrambled what fighters they could: Ki-61 Tonys, Ki-84 Franks, and a dwindling number of Zeros. But when they climbed to meet the bombers, they found the sky already filled with P-51s, glinting silver arcs descending from above. This time the escort was heavier, the tactics refined. The Mustang group split into high and low elements. The high cover intercepted fighters before they reached the bombers, while the low group swept airfields and rail yards to prevent reinforcements. It was air domination in motion, methodical, ruthless, unstoppable. Japanese engineers stationed at Tachikawa watched the battle unfold in disbelief. They had spent years perfecting lightweight designs, planes that could climb fast, turn tight, and dive with courage. But courage could not close the gap in physics. At full throttle, the Ki-84 Hayate could reach nearly 390 km/h, but the Mustang cruised at 360 for hours, with fuel to spare. When the Hayate's engine sputtered for lack of fuel, the Mustang still had the range to chase, fight, and return. From their labs, the engineers began desperate calculations. How far from Iwo Jima to Tokyo? About 750 miles. How long can a Zero fly before it must land? 2 hours at best. And this American fighter, it flies that far, and fights too? The answers made no sense, yet the evidence filled the skies. By April, the Mustang escort system had evolved into a daily cycle of precision and endurance. Each mission began before dawn, when the pilots assembled on the hot black sand of Iwo Jima. They were young, many barely in their 20s, yet their discipline was absolute. Before takeoff, flight leads would remind them: trim, mixture, fuel sequence. Drop tanks only when empty. Every ounce mattered. They would climb to cruising altitude, the roar of their engines fading into thin air as they disappeared into the Pacific horizon. 6 hours later, they would appear again over Tokyo, Yokohama, or Osaka, their timing synchronized with the B-29 raids. The Japanese interceptors, already stretched thin, found themselves outnumbered in their own skies. One pilot, Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, a veteran of dozens of air battles, wrote in his log, "They appeared from nowhere. Their fuel never ended. I thought perhaps they carried a secret tank in their wings, or perhaps they had found a way to make the air itself their fuel. In reality, the secret lay in the Packard Merlin engine, a precisely engineered, high-altitude masterpiece copied from the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. Its two-stage supercharger gave the Mustang both range and altitude performance that Japanese designs couldn't match. Combined with aerodynamic laminar-flow wings, the aircraft wasted almost no energy in drag. Every drop of fuel carried it farther than any opponent believed possible. Meanwhile, Japanese engineers at Nakajima and Mitsubishi tried to decode this miracle. They inspected wreckage, ran tests, and even dismantled a captured Merlin engine. What they discovered shocked them. Manufacturing tolerances measured to thousandths of an inch, far beyond Japan's industrial capacity under bombing conditions. Each Mustang was not just a plane. It was a symbol of industrial precision, the sum of a production system untouched by war on its own soil. April turned into May, and the missions intensified. On May 29, 1945, over Yokohama, the Japanese Air Force made one of its last concentrated defense efforts. Dozens of Ki-84s and N-1K-2J Shidens scrambled to intercept a wave of B-29s escorted by over 150 Mustangs. The sky over Tokyo Bay became a mosaic of vapor trails and flame. The Mustangs swept through in coordinated sections: high cover, mid-escort, and low sweep. In less than 30 minutes, the Japanese formations were shattered. Reports from the ground tell of engineers and officers watching in stunned silence as dogfights unfolded over the capital. It was not just defeat, one survivor recalled, it was revelation. The revelation was that range, the invisible measure of war, had finally broken Japan's defensive circle. For the first time in history, the nation's skies no longer belonged to its own pilots. By the end of June, Japan's air resistance had collapsed. The Mustangs, once thought incapable of such distances, now patrolled the skies unopposed, strafing airfields, supply lines, and even naval vessels near the coast. The engineers who once designed the Zero now met quietly, defeated in their own discipline. Their aircraft had been built for honor. The Mustang had been built for endurance. That was the true turning point, because once endurance triumphed over bravery, the war in the air was already lost. By July 1945, Japan's air war was effectively over. The once proud Imperial Air Force, the same that had swept across Asia and stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was now a shattered shell of its former self. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed by Japanese analysts as too heavy and over-engineered, now ruled the skies over the homeland. From their bases on Iwo Jima, hundreds of Mustangs patrolled the Pacific airspace daily. They escorted B-29s on deep penetration raids, hunted down survivors on retreating airfields, and strafed transport convoys with relentless precision. For the Japanese defenders, it was no longer a question of courage. It was physics, engineering, and exhaustion. Tokyo's air defense network had once been layered with early warning posts, interceptor bases, and anti-aircraft positions. Now every layer was compromised. Mustangs flew higher than expected, stayed longer than believed possible, and struck from angles that radar operators couldn't anticipate. Even when Japan's last operational fighters managed to take off, the psychological weight was unbearable. Pilots knew their range, 2 hours of flight, no more, while the Americans came and went as they pleased. The sense of asymmetry was crushing. One Japanese lieutenant interviewed after the war recalled the despair. They followed us home. We would land with fumes left in our tanks, and still they circled above. They had fuel, time, and patience. We had none. At the same time, American intelligence units were collecting the results of Japan's frantic attempts to catch up. Captured airfields revealed rushed experimental projects, long-range Zero prototypes, drop tank-equipped interceptors, even crude attempts to mimic laminar-flow wing shapes. But the efforts were too late. Japan lacked the refined aluminum alloys, the high-octane fuel, and the uninterrupted production infrastructure that gave the Mustang its endurance. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the impact of the Mustang's range went beyond combat. The fighter's ability to escort B-29s all the way from the Marianas to Tokyo, and later from Iwo Jima, changed the entire rhythm of the bombing campaign. Before the Mustang, B-29 crews flew alone, vulnerable to interception and forced to fly higher, burning more fuel and reducing accuracy. With the Mustang, they could now attack lower, faster, and with devastating precision. Loss rates plummeted. Accuracy soared. Industrial cities that had once survived by sheer distance, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, now burned under relentless daylight attacks. From the American perspective, this was the fulfillment of a hard-learned truth. Air supremacy was not about speed or firepower alone, but reach. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Iwo Bomber Command, noted in a report, "It is not the bombs that broke Japan's back, but the certainty that no sky above her was safe." For Japanese engineers, the Mustang became an obsession even after the war. Many of them, when interviewed during the American occupation, spoke not with hatred but admiration. They studied its construction, its maintenance systems, and the way every component was designed for efficiency and durability. At Nakajima's dismantled facilities, engineers found a partially intact P-51 wreck brought down by flak. They carefully measured its structure, noting the perfect balance between strength and weight. One engineer reportedly whispered, "This was built by a nation that never feared distance." The lesson was painful but clear. Japan's entire aircraft design philosophy, built around short range, agility and pilot bravery, had met its technological limit. The war had begun with daring pilots and ended with industrial endurance, and at the center of that transformation stood a single aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, the machine that redefined the range of war itself. The skies were no longer about who could fight hardest, but who could reach the battlefield first and stay there longest. By the summer of 1945, the transformation of aerial warfare was complete. Japan's once vast empire, defended by distance, ocean, and faith, had been breached by technology. The P-51 Mustang symbolized this shift more than any single weapon. It was not just a fighter. It was a declaration that American engineering, logistics, and production could reach anywhere on Earth. At air bases across Japan, wreckage told the story in silence. Fragments of the Mustang's laminar-flow wings, its polished fuselage, its drop tanks scattered across airfields like confessions of defeat. To Japanese engineers who studied them after surrender, each detail revealed a painful truth. The Allies had mastered industrial harmony. Every part of the Mustang, from its precision-machined engine mounts to its carefully riveted panels, reflected a level of mass production that Japan could never match during wartime isolation. Factories in California, Texas, and Michigan built Mustangs faster than Japan could repair its airfields. The U.S. had learned how to convert peacetime manufacturing skill into wartime mastery. When North American aviation designed the P-51 in 1940, it had taken only 117 days from blueprint to prototype. That speed, born from peacetime competition and industrial confidence, was unthinkable in Japan's rigid, resource-starved system. By 1945, that same system was producing over 15,000 Mustangs, each carrying the same precision and range that had once seemed impossible. For Japan's Air Technical Bureau, the question after defeat was not merely how the Mustang flew so far, but why their own technology could not. Their answer came from a mix of humility and clarity. Japan's aircraft designs, like the legendary Zero, were masterpieces of lightness and maneuverability. But they sacrificed endurance, armor, and survivability. The Mustang proved that true superiority in modern war demanded something else: balance. It could outclimb most Japanese fighters yet cruise for hours. It could dogfight at low altitude and escort at high. It could strike deep, return safely, and be rebuilt overnight. It represented not a single breakthrough, but the synthesis of hundreds of small ones, from engine cooling to aerodynamics, metallurgy, and fuel efficiency. When Japanese engineers disassembled the Merlin engine, they were awestruck by its polish. Its pistons, valves, and turbines reflected years of peacetime industrial perfection. In Japan, such precision would have required hand-fitting by master craftsmen. In America, it came from assembly lines. As surrender loomed in August 1945, American Mustangs began to patrol unopposed. They photographed bomb damage, escorted supply aircraft, and enforced air superiority without firing a shot. The silence of those final missions was haunting. The same engines that had once roared over Tokyo now glided peacefully through clear skies. When Japan finally capitulated on August 15th, the skies were already in American domain. In the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, several Mustang pilots flew overhead, circling quietly above Tokyo Bay, unseen by most below, but symbolizing the invisible victory that had made everything possible. For the Japanese, the war's end brought a painful kind of enlightenment. Their engineers, men who had dedicated their lives to national defense, now studied under Allied supervision. They were allowed to rebuild, this time with access to technologies once forbidden. And in that rebuilding, the lessons of the P-51 took root. It taught Japan that engineering supremacy was not in raw courage or ideology, but in precision, efficiency, and endurance. In the decades that followed, many of those same engineers would apply those lessons to new fields: cars, ships, electronics, building the post-war Japan that astonished the world. The aircraft that had once humbled them in war had, in a strange way, also inspired them in peace. The P-51 Mustang had not just defeated an enemy. It had rewritten the meaning of distance, power, and industrial art. And though the war would soon end in atomic fire, the quiet revolution had already taken place in the skies above Tokyo, where Japanese engineers once looked upward in disbelief and realized that the true secret of victory was not how far a plane could fly, but how far a nation's imagination and industry could take it. In the quiet months after Japan's surrender, the skies over the Pacific grew still again. But for those who had witnessed the war's final chapter, pilots, engineers, and soldiers on both sides, the image of the P-51 Mustang cutting through the high blue remained unforgettable. It was more than a machine. It was the visible edge of an invisible empire, an empire of precision, innovation, and industrial unity. The Japanese called it the ghost of distance because it erased what had once protected them, the ocean itself. For generations, Japan had believed geography was its shield, but the Mustang proved that in the modern age, technology could conquer geography. The aircraft's beauty lay not in its violence, but in what it represented: the harmony of design, the triumph of endurance, and the quiet dominance of intelligence over impulse. Every rivet, every curve, every drop tank was the product of a civilization that had mastered the balance between creativity and discipline. And that balance, not firepower alone, reshaped the destiny of nations. For American pilots, the Mustang was a symbol of freedom and reach, the power to defend and to end. For Japanese engineers, it became a lesson written in metal and fuel, that innovation is not born in isolation, but in cooperation, education, and precision. The Mustang had crossed oceans, conquered skies, and in its final act, connected two worlds that would one day rebuild together. From the ashes of war, a new understanding emerged, that the future would belong not to those who fought the hardest, but to those who built the smartest. And so, long after its engine noise faded, the spirit of the P-51 Mustang continued to echo in the factories of Detroit, the design rooms of Tokyo, and the shared belief that imagination, when disciplined by purpose, could carry humanity farther than any aircraft ever could.